Today's today's daf is daf Lamed Zayin, and we begin on Lamed Vav Amud Beis. On the bottom of the Amud, the Mishnah that opens up the fourth parak of Zevachim. Now, the first paragraph in the Mishnah addresses the question of what's called matan domim, which means that the dam of the korban has to be nizrak. It has to be thrown on the kronos on the corners of the mizbeach. Beit Shammai omrim kol anitonim al mizbeach hachitzon. We'll soon see that there are what's called chatos pnimios, where the avodas hadam is done inside the heichal, but that's not what we're talking about now. Shenasa matona achas kiper. So, as a general rule, according to Beit Shammai, and this rule that we're about to formulate applies even according to Beis Hill, there's no machlokas about it, that with regard to all korbanos, says Beit Shammai, with the exception of chatos, the matan domim that's absolutely critical is only on one of the four corners of the mizbeach. However, b'chatos, here's where Beit Shammai is going to disagree with Beis Hillel, and he says that with regard to korban chatos, shtei matanos, we need a minimum of two matanos, which means on two corners of the mizbeach. Beis Hillel omrim af chatos has no different status than all the other korbanos. Shenesona matana achas kiper, one matana, otherwise known as an asina of dam on one of the corners of the mizbeach, is sufficient. Now, lefichach, at this point, the Mishnah is going to show us the implication as far as the machshavas pigul is concerned, because as a general rule, machshavas pigul is mefagelas. It only affects pigul if the korban is not already validated. Once the korban is validated, for example, in the case of all korbanos, according to Beis Hillel, with one nesina, or according to Beit Shammai, with respect to all korbanos, with the exception of chatos, one nesina is sufficient. So if he goes ahead, which he's supposed to do as a mitzvah, and put the dam on other matanos, on other kronos, then a machshava of pigul will not effectuate pigul, because with the first matana, which was the critical matana, he's already effectuated, he's already accomplished the validity of the korban. That's called kiper. So lefichach if nosan eser rishona ketikun v'sashniya chutz zmana kiper, even if he does a second nesina, which he has to do lechatchila for the mitzvah, and he has in mind chutz l'zmana, which normally would be machshavas pigul, it does not effectuate pigul, because he's already fulfilled the critical requirement when he does the zrika on one of the four kronos. However, in the reverse case, where when he got to the first matana, which is the critical matana, he had a machshav of chutz l'zmano machshavas pigul, v'hashniya chutz l'mkoma, and you might say that at this point the korban becomes posel, and once the korban is posel, it cannot become pigul. The Mishnah says no, pigul v'chayoven aleh kares. Why? Because since at the time of the first matana, which was the critical matana, he had in mind chutz l'zmano, that effectuates pigul. The fact that afterwards, in a second matana, he had in mind a machshava poselis of chutz l'mkomo, that's not going to undermine the chalos pigul, which was already chal at the moment that he implemented the first matana for the sake of chutz l'zmano. The Mishnah continues, Kol hanitonim al hamizbech hapnimi shechiser achas min matonos lo kiper. Okay, so now the Mishnah moves over to what's called a chatas pnimis. Now, in the introduction to this parak, he has a list of 5 chatos pnimios. One is called the par helim dover shel tzibur. The other is seirei avodas kochavim. The third is par kohen Mashiach. The fourth is the par of Yom Kippur, and the fifth is soir shel Yom Kippur. Now, in all these cases, the avodas hadam is done inside the heichal, and there's also hazoyas hadam. And basically, the dam has to reach the mizbeach hapnimi, which is otherwise known as mizbeach hazahav. And our Mishnah establishes that with regard to the dam on a chatas hapnimis, he's got to implement, and this is absolutely critical, the matanos on all sides of the mizbeach. So therefore, if he only gave one of the matanos, or for that matter, he did all but minus one and he omitted one, then lo kiper, the korban is not kosher, it's invalid. Lefichach nosan kulam kitikunam bi'acha shelo kitikuna psula v'ein bo koris. If at any point, even let's say he did all the zrikos kitikunam according to the halacha, but then the last one, he had in mind a machshava poselis, that passes the korban, because he needs every single nesina is critical in order to validate the korban. Now, this may be way beyond our pay scale, but I'll just mention that this Mishnah reflects the opinion that ein pigul lechatzi matir. What does that mean? When he gets to the last matana and he has a machshava of chutz zmano, you and I would have said that that could generate machshavas pigul because the korban is not yet kosher. But the answer is that since in a case of a chatas hapnimis, I need the entire matrix, the entire constellation of all the matanos, they form like one entity and integrate into one whole, and therefore any single matana, if he has a machshava hamafagelos of chutz zmano, could not generate pigul because that's only chatzi matir, meaning the matir that is going to generate the power of the kapara to be effectuated by the matana is a compilation, or shall we say, a sum total of all the different matanos. Okay, we begin the Gemara now. Tana Rabbanan. So if we had a whiteboard, this would be called Brisa number 1, because we're going to have Brisa number 2, Brisa number 3, and so forth. So Brisa number 1 says Minayin linitanim al mizbeach hachitzon. So now we're talking about the classical chatos hachitzonios. Shenisana b'matana achas shekiper. Our Mishnah universally, both according to Beit Shammai and according to Beis Hillel, accepts that in all korbanos, again, Beit Shammai has one exception in the case of chatos, but in all other korbanos, one matana is sufficient. How do we know such a thing? Talmud Lomar, Vidam Zvachecha Yishofech. Now, this pasuk, Vidam Zvachecha Yishofech, is being used by the first brisa number 1, to derive the conclusion that one matana is critical and generates the validity, the kapara of the korban. We're going to see soon that this pasuk teaches many, many other different things. And if it does, then we no longer have this pasuk free to derive the conclusion that we want to derive here from brisa number 1, namely that one nesina is critical. And therefore the Gemara immediately asks, Vahai, this pasuk, lahachi dasa, it's coming to teach us that one matana is critical and sufficient to validate the korban haimi boile l'chresanya. We need it for another brisa. And now we start today's daf on daf Lamed Zayin. Minayim l'chol hadomim shetu'unim matan dam liyisod. Every single, okay, this is called shirayim. We've touched on this in the past. When there's dam after the zrika that was left in the klishares, which is called a mizrag, that remaining dam has to be poured on the yisod hamizbeach. And that's a separate mitzvah that the Torah requires, and it's derived according to this second brisa. We're now in brisa number 2, from the pasuk v'dam zvachecha yishafech. Now you might ask me, how do we know that this pasuk is referring to shfichas shirayim? And the answer is because of the word yishafech. With regard to all other avodas hadam, with the exception of shfichas shirayim, the Torah never uses the word yishafech, but always employs the term nesina. Nesina means to throw it on the mizbeach. Here we're talking about pouring it on the mizbeach, and therefore the Gemara concludes that this is not on the top of the mizbeach, but rather on the base of the mizbeach, and that's the mitzvah of shirayim. But how now can we use the pasuk v'dam zvachecha yishafech to derive the conclusion about the minimum requirement of one nesina as being critical to effectuate the validity of the korban, the kapara of the korban, when we need that pasuk for the mitzvah of shvichas shirayim? And the Gemara answers that this second brisa, that the first brisa doesn't need the pasuk of v'dam zvachecha yishafech to derive the mitzvah of shvichas shirayim, because that Tana of the first brisa has a different source, which we'll see in the name of Rebbe in the coming brisa, from which we derive as a biblical source the mitzvah of shvichas shirayim. This Sanya, and this is nafkalei mit Rebbe, as we saw Rebbe Omer, v'nishar b'dam yimotze. So now the word v'nishar, apparently, according to Rebbe, is meant to be interpreted as the leftover remnants of the dam, as we said before in the klishars, after he implemented all the zrika. And now Rebbe says there's an extra word here in the pasuk. The word badam could be completely omitted at no loss, and for that we have to see the pasuk inside. I'll read it to you. It's from Dvarim Yud Beis. V'asisa olasecha habasar v'adam al mizbach Hashem Elokecha. So already at the beginning of the pasuk, the word dam appears, and then the end of the pasuk says v'dam zvachecha yishafech. So why the extra word v'dam? Says Rebbe, she'ein talmid lom v'dam. I don't need that extra word v'dam. It's totally superfluous because it's a repetition of the word dam that we have previously in the same pasuk in the reish of the pasuk. Ma talmid lom v'dam. Why did the Torah add the word v'dam? It must be teaching me some halacha. Which halacha is it teaching me? Lefisha lo lamadata lo lamadu el linitonim matan dal shetu'unim matan domim liyesod. This mitzvah of shvichas shirayim al yesod only applies to a chatos as far as the explicit biblical reference is concerned. And in the parsha of chatos, there we have clearly the matan domim b'yisod, the shvichas domim b'yisod. But shar domim b'nail. How do we know that it's not just a separate halach in chatos, but it's halach in dam? Dam korbanos. No matter what korban it is, requires shvicha al yisod. Talmud Lomar, we derive this from badam, which is an extra superfluous word, and it is a ribui. Limed al kol adomim shetunim matan dom liyisod. So now it comes out that Rebbe has a source for the mitzvah of shvichas domim shirayim liyisod. We don't therefore need the pasuk v'dam zvachecha yishofech according to Rebbe to derive the conclusion that we need shvichas dam liyisod. Therefore, that pasuk is extra. It's free to derive the minimum requirement of one matana on one of the kronos of Mizbeach as a validator of the karma to generate kapar. So this is all a combination of the first brisa together with Rebbe. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. How could the first brisa derive the minimum requirement of zrika achas from the pasuk v'dam zvachecha yishofech? I need that pasuk for something else. Akati lahachi udiyasa. I still need it for something else. Now, lahachi udiyasa is a question mark. It's a rhetorical question. Can I use it for that? I need it for l'chresanya for the brisa. Minayin l'nitada b'zrika shenesana b'shvicha yotza. The Torah, as we said before, repeats itself time after time regarding dam in kodshim that it requires nesina. Now, nesina means that you throw it from a distance. Shvicha means you're right up front and you pour it. How do we know that although the Torah lechatchila, if all things are done well and properly requires zrika, how do we know that b'di'eved, if the Kohen, instead of doing that zrika, he did a shvicha, that it would still achieve the hechsher and the kapar of the karma? So this pasuk v'dam zvachecha yishofech is not talking about the yisod mizbeach for the shvicha shirayim, but rather the top of the mizbeach for the application of the dam on the kronos of the mizbeach, to teach you that even if you didn't do, the Kohen messed up, and instead of doing a zrika from richuk makom, from a distance, he did shvicha, it still validates the karma. So how can I use this pasuk for the yisod? We're not talking about the yisod here. We're talking about climbing up to the top of the mizbeach. Now, the first brisa can be interpreted in light of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, as we'll soon see, that you cannot substitute shvicha for zrika or zrika for shvicha. They're two separate entities. Sovala Rabbi Akiva, and therefore I'm not going to use this pasuk v'dam zvachecha yishofech to derive that shvicha can replace or substitute for zrika. No, that's not so. Because lo zrika b'chal shvicha, lo shvicha b'chal zrika, Rabbi Akiva insists that these are two separate entities, and whenever the Torah requires zrika, it's got to be zrika. Shvicha will not validate the carbon for kapara purposes, and vice versa. Tisnan, we learned in a Mishnah, and this Mishnah is in Masechta Psachim, Berach Birkas HaPesach Poters HaZevach, Shel Zevach Lo Poters HaPesach Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. We'll come back to Rabbi Shmuel in just a minute. Just want to fast forward for a second to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, Omer Lo Zu Poteres, Zu V'Lo Zu Poteres Zu. Okay. What is the discussion in the Mishnah at the end of Psachim? We're talking about two karbanos that are brought on the 14th of Nisan. One is the Karban Pesach, and the other is the Karban Chagiga. And there's a fundamental difference between the two. Second, I just want to make sure I get it right. Oh. The blood of the Pesach korban has to be poured on the Mizbeach. That's called shvicha. On the contrary, by contrast, in the case of the blood of the Chagiga, korban, as all other korbanos are concerned, they require zrika. So now comes along Rabbi Akiva, and he says these two, the twain shall never meet. They don't overlap. Whenever the Torah requires zrika, which is true in all korbanos, including the chagiga, you must do zrika. Whenever the Torah requires shvicha, which is only in the case of korban pesach, you must do shvicha. You have to pour it. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva says that the bracha for each korban is going to be fundamentally different in its formulation than the other. And you can't use one bracha for both. However, Rabbi Shmuel holds that if you made a bracha on the Pesach, that bracha on the Pesach could somehow be valid even for the Chagiga. The other way around doesn't work. Apparently, Rabbi Shmuel goes with the logic that that somehow the Chagiga is included under the general rubric of the Pesach, Korban Pesach, and Rabbi Shmuel holds that Zrika could substitute for Shvicha and Shvicha for Zrika. So according to Rabbi Shmuel, we go back to the previous brisa that derives the conclusion from V'dam Zvachecha Yishafech that Shvicha can substitute for Zrika. And therefore, according to Rabbi Shmuel, since both Zrika and Shvicha are interchangeable, therefore the bracha could be Chal. However, again, the Chagiga, if you make a bracha on the Chagiga, Rabbi Shmuel holds that's a separate kiyum. That cannot be related to the Korban Pesach. In any event, just to summarize where we're holding now in this whole matrix, we're now suggesting that the Tana of brisa number 1 holds like Rabbi Akiva, and therefore Shvicha and Zrika are two separate entities, and they cannot substitute one for the other. And therefore, I'm not going to use the pasuk of V'dam Zvachecha Yishafech to teach me that Shvicha can replace B'diavad Zrika, because that's not so according to Rabbi Akiva. Shvicha could never replace Zrika. And therefore, the pasuk V'dam Zvachecha Yishafech is free now to derive the conclusion that one single Nesina on one Keren is sufficient to validate the korban. Akati lahachiyudos. Again, the Gemara is coming back like a punching bag. I still need the pasuk V'dam Zvachecha Yishafech l'chidasanya for another halacha. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, here's a brisa that records a machlokas between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Ach bechar shar o bechar kesev o bechar eis. I'll read the end of the pasuk. Lo tifte kodesh heim es damam tizrok al mizbeach ves chelbam taktir ishay rech nichach Hashem. Lo madnu, says Rabbi Shmuel, what do we derive from this pasuk? Lebechar sheton matan damim ve'murim legabim mizbeach. We'll soon see that Bechar is part of a group that has 3 members. It's called Bechar, Maser, and Pesach. And those 3 have unique halachas. How do we know that the 3 korbanos require Matan Damim on the Mizbeach plus Haktaras HaImurim on the Mizbeach? How do we know this? And the answer is we derive from this pasuk, Ach Bechar Shar. Now, it's very interesting. The pasuk itself has no mention whatsoever of neither Pesach nor Maser. All that's mentioned in this pasuk is Bechar. So although the Torah is outspoken as Damam Tizrok Al Mizbeach, but that Zrika, that reference is only to Bechar. So therefore the brisa continues in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, Maser u Pesach Minayin. How do we know that even Maser and Pesach requires a Nesinas Domim al Mizbeach and Haktoras Haimurim on the Mizbeach? How do we know this? Talmud Lomer V'dam Zvachecha Yishafech. So we're using the pasuk V'dam Zvachecha Yishafech, according to Rabbi Shmuel at least, in order to conclude something about the status of Maser Behema and Korban Pesach, namely that they need matan domim. So Mamela, how could I use that pasuk to teach me that in all korbanos, according to Beit Shammai with the exception of Chatas, but according to Beit Hillel, in all korbanos, one matan is sufficient? And the answer is Savar Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Just like we said that the Tana of Bryson of one holds like Rabbi Akiva, we're now going to say the Tana of the first Brisa accepts the sheet of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, the Sanya Rabbi Yossi HaGlili Omer, Dama lo nemar ela damam, in this very same pasuk from Bamidbar Yud Ches in the Parsha Bechor, the Torah used the plural damam. Why does the Torah use the plural? Chelbo, again, instead of saying chelbo in the singular, it says ela chelbam in the plural. Limed al bechor maser pesach sheton matan domim ve'murim legabe mizbeach. So this extra word damam, written in the plural form, according to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, is going to teach me that the matan domim is a requirement in 3 different korbanos. Number 1, bechor, which is explicit in the Torah. Number 2, Maser, and number 3, Pesach. B'meila, if I'm using the pasuk of Damam and Chelbam to teach me that in these 3 korbanos we need matan domim, the original brisa, accepting the view of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, is free to learn from the pasuk V'dam Zvachecha Yishofech that one matana is sufficient, is critical. So the Gemara now says the following. Wait a minute. Rabbi Yishmael, Hai Kra Mafik Le'Lahachi? Is it really true that Rabbi Yishmael uses the pasuk to teach me that if he substitutes shficha for zrika, then b'di'evid the korban is kosher, umapik le'lahachi, and how can we say therefore that Rabbi Shmuel is going to use the pasuk to teach me that shficha can substitute b'di'evid for zrika, and then at the same time Rabbi Shmuel uses this pasuk to teach me that we need matan domim in both Maser and Pesach. And the Gemara says, Trei Tanoia, leave it to Rabbi Yishmael. There are 2 traditions about Rabbi Yishmael. Gemara now asks, this is already like a separate sugya on a digression of sorts. Bishleim il Rabbi Yishmael, demukim leila kula v'bechor. Right, Rabbi Yishmael says that the pasuk is referring to Bechor. And why does it use the plural of damam? Because we're talking about 3 different subcategories or types of bechor. That's shor, kesev, or a's. So I understand hainu detzivu b'soram yelecha. The end of the pasuk says that the basar belongs to the kohanim. So the whole pasuk is dealing with bechor, and it's teaching me, according to Rabbi Shmuel, that all 3 types of bechor, whether it be kesef, whether it be a's, and so forth, they all belong to the kohen. El Rabbi Yossi, the mukale nami le maser upesach. The triple header here is not the 3 different categories of bechor, but rather to teach me that A bechor, B maser, C korban pesach, they all need matan domim. Is then maser upesach be'olim ochlile. According to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, it would seem, therefore, and this is problematic, that we only know that, in other words, how does the pasuk say, Besaram Yelecha, Mayu Besaram Yelecha? Again, according to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, he's interpreting the pasuk that it's referring to three categories and three different types of karbanos, not only to Bechor, but also to Maser and Pesach. Now, when the Torah goes ahead and says, Ubsaram Yelecha, it would seem that that's referring specifically to Bechor, because in that pasuk, it doesn't say damam in the plural to indicate that we're talking about Maser Pesach. Now, the word Ubesaram is written in the plural. Why would the word Ubesaram be written in the plural when only of these three, only one of those three, namely the Bechar, belongs to the Kohanim? Korban Pesach clearly doesn't belong to the Kohanim, it belongs to the Bailim. Maaser clearly doesn't belong to the Kohanim, it belongs to the Bailim. Why does it say Ubesaram Yelecha? I think where it says Echad Tam v'Echad Balmum. So it works like this. If the Bechar is a Tam without any blemish, then it's brought on the Mizbeach. And the meat is eaten by the Kohanim. They own the meat. If, on the other hand, the Bechar is a Balas Mum, and therefore it cannot be brought on the Mizbeach, so what do we do with the Bechar that was born a Bechar to its mother, Petarechem? And the answer is, we give it over to the Kohanim. And the Kohanim own that animal. They will eat that meat.